Have you ever felt like you lost absolutely everything that mattered in your life? That agonizing feeling that the entire universe is conspiring against you and that there is no way out. Imagine the following scene. You need to pack up your entire life, leave your home and your history behind, and move to a foreign and completely unknown country just to try to survive a crisis. And after doing all that and trying to start over, you lose the only people who connected you to that place and gave you some hope. That is exactly what we are going to talk about today. A true and ancient story about extreme loss, painful grief, unwavering loyalty, and how a small and simple act of kindness can change the course of human history forever and ever. Stay with me until the end of this video, because this is not just an ancient story about the past of distant people. It is a direct reflection of how we deal with our own tragedies, fears, and fresh starts today. We are going back in time right now, traveling over 3,000 years into the past, straight to the dusty and unforgiving lands of the ancient Middle East. To be more exact, it all starts in a small farming village called Bethlehem. And this video was made perfectly for you who perhaps understand absolutely nothing about ancient texts, religions, or the Bible, but who are passionate about a true story of overcoming and deep human drama. In that cruel time, there was no kind of structured government to help you in times of crisis. There was no life insurance, food bank, or social security. If you didn't have a piece of fertile land or a large and strong family to support you, you were literally doomed to starve to the end. Daily survival was brutal and exhausting, and depended entirely on the community around you, who you knew, and how nature behaved each season. And our story begins right in the middle of a terrible climate and economic crisis. Devastating and prolonged famine hits the town of Bethlehem hard, drying up the fields and killing the livestock. And an ordinary man named Elimelech realizes that his family will not survive if they stay there. Therefore, he decides to take drastic action, taking his wife, a woman named Naomi, and his 2 young sons, and setting off on a dangerous journey in search of any place that had food. They travel through the mountains until they reach a neighboring but historically rival land, a place called Moab, and surprisingly, they manage to settle there as immigrants. They find food, and life seems like it is finally going to get back on track and give them a little peace. But a sudden and inexplicable tragedy happens. Elimelech, Naomi's husband, suddenly dies, leaving the family in shock. Therefore, Naomi suddenly finds herself completely alone, carrying the stigma of being a widow in a foreign land that is not hers, having only her 2 young sons as her only guarantee of protection and future. And the difficult years pass slowly. The pain of the loss settles, and Naomi's 2 sons grow up healthy, and they end up marrying women from that very region, women of Moab, from a different culture and customs. One of these women was named Orpah, and the other was named Ruth. And the 3 families lived together in apparent harmony for almost 10 long years, building memories and trying to move forward. But the unthinkable and the terrible happens again in this woman's life. for reasons that the ancient text does not explain to us, and fate does not justify. Naomi's 2 sons fall ill and also die prematurely. Therefore, the scenario now is absolutely bleak. We have 3 grieving widows living completely alone in a ruthless ancient world that was governed exclusively by men, with no husbands to defend them, no sons to support them, and absolutely no source of income, property, or legal protection. And Naomi finds herself completely plunged into the darkness of depression. The grief consumes her in such a heavy way that she can barely find the strength to get out of bed. She is already aging, exhausted from life's beatings, and feels like she has lost absolutely everything she loved in the world. And then, amidst the silence of her pain, she hears a distant rumor, a whisper brought by travelers coming from her homeland. She hears that the drought and famine in Bethlehem have finally come to an end, and that the fields are producing bread again in Israel. Therefore, she makes a final and definitive decision. She decides to gather the few belongings she has left, tie up her bundles, and return home, believing that her only option now is to go back and die in the land where she was once born and was happy. And her 2 young daughters-in-law, Orpah and Ruth, who loved their mother-in-law very much, decide to pack their things and accompany her at the beginning of this long journey down the dusty road. But halfway there, under the harsh desert sun, Naomi stops walking. She turns around, looks deeply into the faces of those 2 young women who still had their whole lives ahead of them, and the harsh reality hits her mind hard. She knows she has absolutely nothing to offer them in her country. She is no longer of age to have other sons who could marry them in the future, and she knows very well that, in the closed culture of her homeland, a foreign Moabite and widowed woman would be treated with enormous suspicion, prejudice, and contempt. Therefore, Naomi begins to cry and begs them both to turn back. She tells them with a broken heart, "Go back to your mother's homes. May the universe be kind to you, just as you were kind to my sons who died, and to me. Find new husbands, build new lives away from me, because my life has become far too bitter, and it seems that the very hand of fate has turned against me." And Orpah, hearing those harsh and realistic words, breaks down in many tears. She cries out loud, hugs Naomi tightly for the last time, and, understanding the logic of the situation, turns her back and returns the way they came, going back to her old life and her old customs. But the other daughter-in-law, Ruth, reacts in a way that defied all human logic and self-preservation. Ruth physically refuses to let go of Naomi. She holds her elderly mother-in-law, stares into the eyes of that woman broken by grief, and makes one of the most impressive and beautiful declarations of loyalty and love ever recorded in the entire history of humanity. Ruth says loud and clear, "Do not urge me to leave you or to turn back from you, because wherever you go, I will go, and wherever you stay, no matter how bad the place is, I will stay with you. From today on, your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Where you die, there I will die also, and there I will be buried by your side." Therefore, upon hearing such determination, Naomi realizes that there is no argument in the world capable of changing the mind of this stubborn and loyal young woman. And the two women, united now by an unbreakable bond of pain, poverty, and hope, continue alone on the long and dangerous walk through the valleys until they reach Bethlehem. And they finally spot and arrive at the gates of the town of Bethlehem, exactly at the busiest time of the year, the beginning of the barley harvest. The entire small town is in an uproar, and people rush to see Naomi back after more than a decade. But when the old neighbors look at her, they are shocked because she is so aged, so marked by suffering, and so sad that she barely looks like the same person. And Naomi, feeling the weight of the stairs, tells everyone in the square, "Please, do not call me Naomi anymore," which means sweet and pleasant. "From today on, call me Mara," which means bitter, because I left this town with my hands full, with my husband and my sons. But life has brought me back completely empty and alone. And despite being back, the harsh reality of everyday life gave no quarter. They didn't have a grain of food in the pantry. They had no coins in their pockets, and they didn't have a proper house of their own to live in. Therefore, they needed to come up with an immediate action plan so they wouldn't starve in the coming days. And there was a very old and essential rule in that agricultural culture. A law made precisely to ensure the social protection of the most vulnerable. This law mandated that farm owners could not harvest the grain all the way to the extreme edges of their fields, nor could they go back to pick up the bundles that accidentally fell to the ground during the work. They had an obligation to leave these fallen leftovers on purpose in the field, so that the poorest people, the orphans, the immigrants, and the widows could glean these scraps and have the chance to work for their own food. And Ruth, showing immense courage, offers to go alone to the fields to work under the scorching sun to do exactly that, picking up the leftovers. But what seemed to be just a random day of work in the life of a beggar was, in fact, about to change everything. Seemingly by accident, and without knowing who owned the property, she ends up choosing to work in the field of an extremely rich, respected, and powerful man in the town, a man named Boaz. And Boaz was not just any farmer. He was a distant relative of Naomi's late husband, Elimelech. That same afternoon, he arrives at the field to inspect his workers, and from afar, he immediately notices that young, foreign-looking woman working exhaustingly, bent over picking up ears of grain nonstop. He turns to the foreman of the workers and asks who that unknown woman is. And the foreman explains that she is the famous young Moabite who came back from Moab with Naomi, and tells in detail how she has been tireless, working since sunrise, resting only for a few minutes in the shade. Boaz, impressed with her work ethic and her story, then approaches Ruth personally. But instead of kicking her off his land or treating her with the disdain that many rich men would have for a destitute immigrant, he treats her with profound kindness and respect. He tells her in a fatherly way not to go gleaning in any other field in the region where she could be harassed or assaulted. He orders her to stay close to his own female servants, and even offers her fresh water from his workers' jars and baked bread from his own private stash. Therefore, Ruth is completely amazed by his attitude, bows to the ground, and asks why such an important man is being so incredibly good and protective to a worthless foreigner. And Boaz answers, his voice full of admiration, that he has heard about absolutely everything she sacrificed for Naomi, about how she left her own parents, her gods, and her homeland out of love for an old widow, seeking refuge under the wings of the God of Israel. And Ruth continues working hard and returns home that night carrying an absurd amount of food on her shoulders, a basket so full of threshed barley that it was much more than anyone could get just by gleaning the leftovers of a field. She puts the food on the table and shows everything to Naomi with a smile on her face. But when Naomi asks whose field she worked in and discovers that Ruth had been helped precisely by Boaz, the old widow's dull eyes widen and shine with a spark of hope for the first time in many years. Naomi immediately realizes that this was no simple coincidence, because Boaz was not just a rich and kind man. He was what their legal culture called a kinsman redeemer. A kinsman redeemer, in that ancient society, was a male relative who had the moral and legal duty to protect the most vulnerable members of the clan. He had the obligation to buy back family lands that had been lost to debt. And most importantly, he was supposed to marry the widow of a deceased relative without children to generate an heir and continue the lineage and the name of the one who passed away. Therefore, Naomi, who knew the laws very well and was very astute and experienced, begins to mentally outline a bold and risky plan to try to secure the future, safety, and happiness of both of them once and for all. And the weeks pass productively, and finally, the end of the harvest season arrives. The time of celebration when the men sleep on the thrashing floor, which is an open space of packed dirt where they separate the grain from the chaff by throwing everything up in the air with pitchforks, taking advantage of the night wind. They would have a feast, drink, and then sleep right there on the dirt floor to protect the valuable harvest from possible night thieves. And Naomi calls Ruth in private and gives her very precise instructions. She instructs Ruth to take a long bath, put on her best perfumed oils, wear her best dress, and go silently to the thrashing floor in the dark of night. But Naomi's next instruction was extremely dangerous and very delicate for a woman's reputation. She tells Ruth to hide in the shadows, wait until Boaz had eaten, drunk, and fallen into a deep sleep. And then she was to go quietly, lift the blanket covering his feet, and lie down right there, waiting for him to tell her what she should do. Therefore, Ruth swallows her fear and blindly obeys her mother-in-law, running a gigantic risk of being caught in the middle of dozens of men, of being mistaken for a woman of ill repute, and of having her reputation completely destroyed in the town. And in the middle of the dark and silent night, the unexpected happens. Boaz wakes up startled and shivering from the cold hitting his uncovered legs. He turns over, groping in the dark of the thrashing floor, and to his total surprise and shock, discovers that there is a woman lying curled up at his feet. He sits up quickly, unable to see properly, and asks with a raspy voice, "Who are you down there?" And Ruth answers with a soft but firm voice, "I am your servant Ruth. Please, spread the corner of your garment over your servant, for you are our kinsman redeemer." This act of asking to spread the garment was not a mere request for warmth. It was a formal and deeply symbolic marriage proposal in their culture. It was a bold plea for him to fulfill the law, to assume financial and family responsibility for her, and also for Naomi, pulling them out of absolute misery. But although Boaz is deeply touched, honored by her courage, praising her character for not going after younger men, whether rich or poor, and promises to do everything she asked, there is a major problem that threatens to destroy the entire plan. A gigantic technical and legal obstacle blocks their path. Boaz sighs in the dark and explains to Ruth that unfortunately, he is not the closest relative in the family's line of succession. There is another man in town, closer to Elimelech, who has, according to the law, the absolute priority and the first right to redeem the land and marry her. Therefore, Boaz tells her to lie down and stay safe there until just before dawn, so that no one sees her and speaks ill of her. And at the first ray of light, he fills her shawl with an enormous amount of freshly harvested grain, so she doesn't go back empty-handed to her mother-in-law, and solemnly promises that he will sort out this whole bureaucratic situation first thing in the morning at the town gate, which was the equivalent of the courthouse at the time, where all business, contracts, and public judgments took place. And with haste and determination, as soon as the sun rises and illuminates the walls, Boaz goes straight to the gates of Bethlehem, sits on the stone bench, calls 10 of the most respected leaders and elders of the town to serve as judicial witnesses, and sits down to wait patiently for that other relative to pass by on his way to work. And exactly as predicted, soon this specific man appears walking down the street. Boaz calls him by name, asks him to sit with the elders, and presents the case publicly in a very strategic way. He clearly says, "Our relative Naomi, who came back from Moab, is selling the piece of land that belonged to our deceased brother, Elimelech. Since you are the closest relative, you have the first right to buy and invest in the land before me." And the man, seeing an excellent business opportunity and thinking about easily expanding his own properties, immediately says with a smile that yes, he agrees to buy and redeem the land. But it is at this exact moment that Boaz plays his final card and reveals the hidden clause that accompanied that land contract. He looks the man in the eyes and says in front of everyone, "It is important that you know that on the exact day you buy the land from Naomi's hands, by force of law, you will also have to acquire Ruth, the young Moabite who is the widow of her son. You will have to marry her to father a son, who will keep the dead husband's name alive on the property, and the land will belong to him in the future." And hearing this heavy condition, the other relative backs away, frightened right then and there. He does the math quickly in his head and realizes that having a new child with Ruth would mean dividing his own current inheritance, complicating the lives of the children he already had, and would cost him a lot of money in the long run to support everyone, without the land remaining for his own lineage. Therefore, he publicly backs out of the deal and declares that he cannot make the redemption without ruining his own inheritance. And to make the withdrawal official, he legally passes his right of redemption to Boaz. Performing the custom of the time, he takes off his own sandal from his foot and hands it over to Boaz in front of the elders, which was the traditional, unquestionable, and valid way of signing a contract and transferring a property right in those ancient lands. And Boaz, holding the sandal, and with a heart full of joy, for he had already fallen deeply in love and grown attached to Ruth because of her integrity, strength, and noble character, stands up and declares loudly before the elders and all the witnesses of the town that he is, on that day, buying all the properties that belonged to Elimelech and his sons. And most importantly, he is publicly taking Ruth as his lawful wife to perpetuate the family name and protect the widows. All the people gathered there in the square celebrate with shouts of joy, and the leaders bless the new union, wishing that Ruth be as fertile and as great a builder of the people as the ancient matriarchs of the nation. But the magic of this story doesn't stop just at the financial relief and the romantic bureaucracy of a wedding at the town gate. The love, dedication, and unwavering loyalty that were planted way back in the dry sands of the Moab desert begin to bear real, physical, and transforming fruits. Shortly after the wedding, Ruth gets pregnant. Therefore, after 9 months of expectation, a child cries and is born in Bethlehem, bringing an indescribable wave of joy, renewal, and new life to a broken family that, for 10 years, only knew the smell of death, the taste of grief, and the emptiness of abandonment. And the scene in the town is completely transformed. The same women of the town who years before had seen Naomi return bitter and depressed now run to her in her new home with wide smiles and say with emotion, "Praise be to God, who today has not left you without a redeemer and a family. May the name of this boy be famous throughout the nation. May he bring rest to your soul and be the support and joy of your old age. For your daughter-in-law Ruth, who loves you with all her soul, and who has proven to be better and more valuable to you than 7 sons, is the one who gave birth to this baby." And Naomi, with her eyes overflowing with tears of pure gratitude, takes the tiny newborn baby, places him gently against her chest on her lap, and becomes the dedicated nurse of that beloved child. That same elderly woman who had returned weeping, declaring herself completely empty and angry at life, was now with a heart overflowing and full of incalculable joy, literally holding the living future of her family and her lineage in her arms. But the silent and grandiose impact of this birth goes far, far beyond what those clay walls of that small and unknown village of Bethlehem could ever imagine. That healthy little boy receives the name Obed. Therefore, the simple survival story of that young foreign widow, poor and immigrant, is intertwined and stitched together forever with the grandiose spiritual and political destiny of an entire nation. And the years continue to pass, and the generations follow one another. Obed grew strong and had a son, whom he named Jesse. And Jesse, years later, living right there in the fields of Bethlehem, had a young and brave son named David, who would go on to defeat giants and become none other than the great King David, the most famous, powerful, and important king in the entire history of the people of Israel. And from this exact same royal lineage, built from the womb of a rejected Moabite, many, many centuries later, would be born the man who would divide the history of the world, Jesus of Nazareth. But it is awe-inspiring to think that absolutely none of this royal lineage and this entire epic story would have happened if it weren't for the quiet decision and courage of a single woman who was at rock bottom of hopelessness. A woman who had every reason to be selfish and run away, but who decided to choose extreme loyalty, love for her neighbor, and sacrifice instead of easy convenience. Therefore, the ancient book of Ruth is definitely not just a tangle of outdated rules about agrarian laws, or a fairy tale about traditions lost in time. It is, in fact, a profound, timeless, and extremely human story about how our simplest daily choices matter, about how the way we choose to treat broken people who seemingly have absolutely nothing to offer us in return can change everything, and about how small daily acts of kindness, silent solidarity, and faithfulness in pain can create invisible waves and reverberations of impact that travel through time and last for eternity. And finally, when you calmly stop to think about all this, you realize that life often seems chaotic, cruel, meaningless, and totally unfair, exactly as it seemed and exactly as it was for the widows Naomi and Ruth right at the dark beginning of their journey in the desert. But the bright guiding thread of this ancient story shows us and guarantees us that even in the midst of the thickest darkness and scenarios of total loss, the silent gears of hope and destiny keep turning endlessly, not through inexplicable magic, but rather through the noble, honest, and faithful attitudes of ordinary and imperfect people who choose to do what is right. Therefore, whenever you wake up and think that your life is at an absolute dead end, or that your pain is too great to bear and the universe has forgotten you, remember the fine dust of that long road to Bethlehem. Remember the dignity of young Ruth, bent over gathering leftover ears of grain under the heat of the scorching sun, just to see a smile on the face of the woman she loved. No matter how bitter your situation is today, your story is also being written right at this exact moment. One small, uncertain, and courageous step at a time. I am immensely grateful that you stayed with me and watched this video up to here. If the courage of this woman or this journey of pain and redemption impacted you, made you reflect, or inspired you in any way, leave down here in the comments below what exact part of this story caught your attention the most and touched your heart. Do not forget to like this video to help us reach more people who need to hear about hope. And subscribe to the channel and turn turn on notifications to dive with us into more epic scripts and transformative stories like this one every week. A big hug. Keep walking your own journey with courage, and see you next time.